Do you have songs that you love and never tire of hearing? Songs that hold your interest? Or maybe you're listening to a song you've never heard before and you think, wow, that music sounds interesting. Well, what makes that music sound interesting? Well, I'll tell you what makes it sound interesting, and that is modulation. In music, and in a lot of songs that you listen to, modulation is one of the most common things to happen. You might recognize it when you hear it, but you don't know the word to use to describe it. Well, the word is modulation. That's a big word. It's not one that we would normally hear in everyday life. So let's talk about modulation. What exactly is modulation in music? Well, the first thing we need to do is go back and talk about keys. Now, you most likely know that just about every song, every classical piece of music, it's in a specific key. So, for example, in an earlier video, I showed you how to play Yankee Doodle Boy, and it was in the key of G. A key just means that a song uses notes from a specific scale. So, Yankee Doodle Boy, or I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy, uses notes from the G major scale. And it also uses the chords that are built on the notes of the G major scale. So if a song is in a specific key, using the notes from a specific scale, we write the key signature of that scale at the start of the music. So the G major scale has 1 sharp, so we put 1 sharp in the key signature. Pretty basic stuff. So what is a modulation now? To modulate in music is to simply change a piece from one key to another. And in most pop songs, modulations are often referred to as key changes. Somebody might say, oh, that song has a lot of key changes. Well, that means the same thing, has a lot of modulation. And if you're reading the sheet music, the key signature may change or it may not. Now, in order for it to be a true modulation, the song has to stay in the new key for a while, more than just for 1 or 2 bars. If a song modulates, but only for a little bit, if it seems like it's going to go to another key, but it doesn't stay there, that's called tonicization. Now, I don't expect you to remember that term, but usually what happens then is the song goes back to the original key. So take, for example, a song like Goodbye Yellow Brick Road by Elton John. He ends the chorus and then he goes to this chord, and now it sounds like he's modulated. But then it goes back with this chord and goes back to the key of F. So it looks like he modulated to the key of A flat very briefly, but it goes right back to the key. So that's more of a tonicization rather than a true modulation. Now, if he had done something like this, now he has truly modulated from F major to A flat major. But that's not what he did. Let's talk about different types of modulation. There are many ways that a song can modulate, but I'm going to go over the main ways that a song can modulate. First, we have the common chord or common tone modulation. We have chain modulations. We have the phrase modulation, and then the chromatic modulation. Now, these are by no means the only ways that songs can modulate. These are, I believe, the 4 most common ways. Let's take a brief look at each one of these. Common chord modulation is where a song modulates via a shared or common chord that the original key and the new key have in common. And that chord is called the pivot chord. So the pivot chord acts as the point that the original key modulates to the new key. So say, for example, you're in the key of C major and you want to modulate to D major. So what are the chords that are common to the keys of C and D? You know the chords in C major are C major, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, B diminished, and C. And then the chords in D major are D, D major, E minor, F sharp minor, G, A, B minor, had to think about it for a second there, C sharp diminished, and then D. So there are two chords that both of these keys have in common. There's E minor, which is the 3 chord in the key of C major, 1, 2, 3, but it's also the 2 chord in the key of D. Also, G major is the 5 chord in C, but it's the 4 chord in D. So you can use either one of these chords as a pivot chord to enable you to modulate from C major to D major. Here's a chord progression, for example. You're playing in C, typical C major progression. Now it's time to modulate to D major. You can go to E minor. So the E minor is the pivot chord. Here's your pivot chord. It's common to both C major and D major, but this chord can now lead as the 2 in D to the 5, your typical 2-5-1 progression. Now you are in D major. Chopin, the famous composer, uses this in his famous C minor prelude. Now we're in C minor. And he's going to quickly modulate to A flat major. How does he do it? Here's your typical progression. And then he goes to this chord. This is A flat major. Now, that is a chord that is part of the C minor scale. A flat is the pivot chord. So he goes from there to from the A flat, and now we're on the 4 chord of A flat major. And then later on, of course, he modulates back to C minor. Now, closely related to the common chord modulation is the common tone modulation. This is a variant of the common chord idea, but instead of a pivot chord, there's a pivot note. So say, for example, you're in the key of B major, and you want to modulate to D major. Now you have this common tone, which is F sharp. It is common to both B major and D major. A lot of times you'll hear all the other notes of the chord disappear. Now you have this single note, and all of a sudden you're in another key. You can even do it again. So that is a common tone modulation. The next kind of modulation we want to look at is called a chain modulation. A chain modulation is one that goes through the circle of fifths in order to get from one key to another. And this is usually done with dominant 7th chords because, as you know, dominant 7th chords strongly lean to the next note in the circle of fifths. So say we're starting on C, and it's leading us to F, the next note in the circle. Here's an example of a circle progression. We start in the key of A, and then we use A7, which leads us to D7, leads us to G7, C7, and then F. That's what we would call a circle progression. You started in the key of A major, and by employing the circle of fifths, you wound up modulating to F major. So that is a chain modulation. You often find that a lot in ragtime music or in jazz music. Sometimes people even refer to it as the ragtime progression. Now, another type of modulation is known as the phrase modulation. Phrase modulation is different from the previous types of modulation because it doesn't have a chord or a note that it modulates on. Instead, it just abruptly changes from one key to the next. Usually, phrase modulation works best with closely related keys, like the keys of A minor and C major in Mozart's Piano Sonata number 11 in A major. Now, a lot of folks are very familiar with the last movement of this sonata. And so it ends, that part of the third movement ends on this half cadence in E minor, but then it immediately modulates to C major without a chord or a note that carries over from one to the next. So it starts in A minor, and then it goes right to C major, and so on. Another famous pop song that does this is by Elton John. I go to Elton John a lot because he does this all the time in a lot of his songs. And in fact, I think I might do a video at some point about Elton John songs where he starts in one key and then the chorus is in a completely different key and he just modulates all over the place. But what happens in this song, this is Gray Seal, and it starts out in B. And then he goes right into key of G. And he gets to the end of the verse. And he's ending on a D chord and then just jumps right back into the key of B. That's called phrase modulation. And that's something that he does a lot in a lot of his songs. Now, one more type of modulation that I'd like to look at briefly is known as chromatic modulation. Chromatic modulation lies somewhere in the middle of these two previous approaches. It's more musically noticeable and abrupt than common tone or common chord modulation. But it doesn't just change keys immediately like phrase modulation. Chromatic modulation uses a chromatic passing tone. In other words, it's a note that keeps its letter name, for example, like C or D or E, but it adds an accidental, like a sharp. So, for example, to get from C major to D minor or D major, we can take the C major chord, C, E, G, and then add a sharp to the C so that it becomes C sharp. And then if we also add A, this becomes A7, which can then resolve to either D minor or D major. So here you are in the key of C. And now we want to modulate. And there we are. Now we're in the key of D major. You can do this in any key. So those are the four main types of modulation. And there's another type of modulation that we see a lot in popular songs. Not so much these days, but I remember back in the 70s listening to Barry Manilow, and it seemed like every song he put out had this kind of modulation, and it's called the step up. And that's when a song simply steps up from one key to a tonally unrelated key, really, but it's usually 1, 2, sometimes 3 semitones higher, 3 half steps higher. And this is usually done at the end or at the final chorus, and it gives that song a bit of extra energy. So, for example, in the song Mandy, just to give you one example. Right, we're in the key of B flat. And when he gets to the end of the song, he wants to give it that little extra burst of energy. So it goes like this. a sudden, we're in the key of C. And then he hits that big high note at the end, which I'm not even going to attempt. So if this step up is related to any of the modulation types that I've mentioned, it's closest to phrase modulation because it's very abrupt, but it can also be very exciting. So there are some of the basic ways that songs modulate. It's a really big concept, and I've talked about it in a previous video and just kind of scratched the surface. And even here, there's a lot more I could talk about when it comes to modulation. So many other ways to do it. Now, if you're listening to classical music, especially a really long piece like a symphony or a concerto, modulation is essential to keeping the music interesting and keeping a piece moving along. And I could talk a lot more about that too. If you're listening to a song and it never modulates, it never changes key, well, it can get boring. Now, that's not a hard and fast rule, by the way. Sometimes the lyrics can carry a song that has no modulations and keep it very interesting. And the first song that came to my mind when I thought about that was by Gordon Lightfoot, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. That's the chord progression. I may not have played it completely correctly, but it just keeps repeating over and over and over again. And if that was it, if you tried to play this song as an instrumental, people would go, oh, come on, this is getting kind of dull. But it's the lyrics, the brilliant lyrics that Gordon Lightfoot wrote, tells a story about this terrible tragedy. And that's what keeps the song interesting. So there are exceptions. But you're going to find that in a lot of songs, modulation is one of the keys to keep that music interesting, to keep your interest, keep you wanting to hear more, and go back and listen to it again. Thank you for watching. I appreciate those of you who have recently subscribed to the channel. Many of you have subscribed. The channel is growing, and for that, I am very, very grateful. If you'd like to support my work on Patreon, I will leave the link right at the top of the description. I also want to give a shout out to Jason, one of my patrons. I thank you so much for your generous support of the channel. And for all of my patrons, thank you so much for your support. It really means a lot to me. Thank you again for watching. I look forward to speaking to you in the next one.